The issue of racism in America is not new. Sadly, the reality of racism in the world is historic and it's ongoing. The extent of the issue we refer to as racism in America has reached new heights or depths depending upon how you consider it. Our nation is confused, perplexed, and as we make this program without an agreed-to solution. But why is that? Is there no solution? Are we doomed to only increasing hostility, division, bitterness, and anger in our nation? Today on Stand in the Gap, we've decided to address this controversial and often complex issue by applying a biblical worldview to it. Today, we hope to bring clarity to this area of confusion and hope to those who despair. I'm Sam Rohrer, and I'll be joined as normal by Pastor Isaac Crockett, as today we invite in a special guest and a friend to Stand in the Gap and to the American Pastors Network as well. He is Dr. Joseph Green. He's the senior pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, founder of the 2019 movement, and a co-host on our Stand in the Gap Today national radio program. Now, over a year ago, Pastor Green joined us for a two-part program where, in less hostile times, we discussed racial issues in a two-part program entitled Successfully Crossing the Racial Divide. The principles and the truth of those programs are so applicable to today. But today, we want to focus on this issue in a fresh way by defining the terms, describing the root problem, identifying the cause, answering some key questions, and then providing biblical solutions. Today's program is entitled Racial Divide or Sinful Pride. And with that, Isaac, let me go to you right now, because this issue of racism we know is so controversial in America. It's almost like nobody can stand up and talk about it without dissatisfying somebody on some sides. Politicians and others are purposely exploiting it for their own gain. That's obvious. But many pastors are often uncomfortable in talking about the issue because of the discomfort. But it's being portrayed as purely black, white, as an example, or maybe even uniquely American. But the issue of division and so forth is much broader than that, isn't it?
Yes, Sam, you're right. It's not just an American problem, and I have family spread out all over the world, and family from all over the world came to America, but I would say it's a human issue. It's a human problem. We all have to look at our own hearts. We all, tend to be more focused on people that have more in common with us rather than, people from other groups. And so it's something that all humans have to look into and check their hearts.
And I want to bring in right now Joe Green. Pastor, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Sam. It's always a pleasure.
We value your input for a lot of reasons, but you're a man of God, you're a pastor, you're a businessman, you pastor in an urban setting. This issue is one that touches us as white and you as black. It affects us all. I found, Joe, and I want you to answer this question, that by being in office for so long as I had been, that so much of our time, I think, is found when we deal with issues, we end up trying to shape symptoms, as I would put it, rather going then to the root problem. This issue that we call racism right now, how should we describe it? Are we shaping symptoms? Should we be going to a root problem? What is that root problem?
I think so, Sam. If when we look at the issue of race in America, it's just one of the many ways that the enemy has used to manipulate us. If you went to a country, I would submit to you, if you went to a country where there was only one ethnicity or one race, you would still have the same issues. But it's more pronounced when we have race involved, because it represents my identity. No matter what I do, I can't change the color of my skin. And it's more pronounced. When I say it's more pronounced from an emotional standpoint, because it's more glaring. But I would say, like I always like to say, that even if everyone was the same race, we would still have murder, we would still have violence, because the Bible describes the enemy as the accuser of the brethren. And when you look at that word in Greek, it's the word kategoros, which means one of the strongest weapons that the enemy has is to divide us into categories in order to accuse us to each other and to have us fighting, hatred, anger, all those type of emotions that come to play. But as I said earlier, race is more pronounced because it's more obvious when two people have different skin colors and two different ethnicities. And from an emotional standpoint, it can be more impactful because as a person of color, I feel like I'm being mistreated simply because of the color of my skin, something that I didn't choose and something that I can't change.
Thank you, Joe. Between what you and Isaac said, ladies and gentlemen, this issue, racial divide or sinful pride, and we've kind of gone to the heart that this is an issue that affects us all no matter where we live. We'll go more into depth when we come back in just a minute.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. I'm Isaac Crockett, and we're joined with Sam Rohrer here. We're talking with our friend and actually one of our co-hosts on the radio, Stand in the Gap, and that's Dr. Joseph Green. And Joe is not only our friend, but he's a great person to talk to about the topic we have today, looking at, is it racism, or are we looking at more of a sinful pride issue, or is it more of a racial divide going on? And Joseph is, Dr. Joseph Green is the pastor, the head pastor at St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He has experience with pastoring and church planting in urban areas. He's also started youth mentoring programs, started the 2019 movement, and he's also a member of and was actually the chairman when it was voted into the 400-year African American History Commission. And that actually went through both the House of Representatives, the Senate, and then was signed into law by the President. So I feel like, Joe, you're extremely qualified to be with us today to talk about, racial divide or sinful pride. And we know each other very well. And in talking, sometimes we kind of take things for granted that we've talked about in the past. I know you've explained on the radio and different things that there aren't actually different races as far as, we're not evolved differently or something, but we're all created in the image of God, one blood. But yet this word racism is a word that we do talk about and needs to be addressed. And so I would like for you maybe to define give us context and maybe biblical definition of what we're talking about when we talk about racism or racist. We have the Black Lives Movement and different politically correct groups throwing that word around a lot right now, but we need to kind of get an accurate, because that's what we're here to do, but get an accurate definition of that to start with.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that is so important, and I've been stressing this a lot lately, if you don't properly define the issue, you can never solve the problem. And for instance, if I had a headache and I keep taking stuff to cure my headache, but the real problem is I have high blood pressure. If I never deal with the high blood pressure, I'm always going to have a headache, and it's going to make me more frustrated and more angry. So when we look at racism, it's important for us to define what racism actually is. What we've been doing a lot in the media and even in our everyday lives is we have been painting with a broad stroke. This word racism has been thrown around. The word racism is racism is systematic and institutional. So, for instance, before the Civil Rights law that was passed in 1964, restaurants could have a sign that said "No blacks allowed." Right. So, me as a black person, if I walked in there, they could call the police, and I would get arrested, right, for breaking the law. After the Civil Rights legislation was passed, if I walked in that same restaurant and they said that they wouldn't serve me because I was black, then I could call the police, and the police would come, and that restaurant owner would suffer a penalty of law. So that's what racism is. It's systematic, it's institutional. You can solve racism by passing laws and legislation, which is what they did, because in America right now, it's against the law to mistreat someone or to, discriminate based on skin color, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. That's how you combat racism. Now, if we never ever define it, and we have people believing that this nation is racism. Now, there was a lot of racism in this nation. Of course, slavery, Jim Crow, and the laws that I had mentioned, that was racism. But when we look at America now, it is actually against the law to discriminate against someone based on race. And so I would say and submit to people that racism may not be completely dead, but we've really done a lot to overcome racism. Now, there's still issues, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But at the end of the day, we have to define what racism really is. We have to stop throwing out that term of systematic racism, especially in regards to interactions like the police and African Americans, because when we don't, we have a heightened sense of anger, bitterness, and frustration because we're trying to solve a problem that we haven't properly defined.
Joe, that makes so much sense, and thank you for bringing that clarity to it. So now let's go the next step. The heart of these issues is a pride issue, a sinfulness, and you were talking about how the enemy wants to divide us and make us find some sort of reason to hate one group or tribe or whatever. So let's go to now maybe more just that natural, basic prejudice or bias as opposed to racism, and maybe you could distinguish those things for us.
Absolutely. A lot of times, we have, like you stated, as human beings, we normally gravitate towards people that look more like us or our community. I like to say jokingly all the time, I've been Black all my life, right? I grew up around Black people, and some of my closest family members are Black as well. So that's what I'm comfortable with. But now when I start to engage with people outside of my community, it takes some, you have to stretch yourself a little bit. So most people naturally gravitate towards people they're familiar with, not only, skin-wise, but also culturally. And so a lot of times we have this misinterpretation because we don't understand people who have a different cultural experience than we do. And I would say in America, a lot of what we see now is this misinterpretation of cultures, along with the pride, as Sam so rightly stated, that we as human beings, a lot of times we have this sin nature and this pride thing that we begin to not only gravitate towards those who are more like us, but we also subconsciously believe that what I am, my culture, my community, is the superior community. So we have to be very careful of that.
And Joe, going again further in looking at what you just talked about, the pride issue is an example. It makes me think of how God views this. And again, we're bringing a biblical worldview to it. Proverbs 6:16 says, "These 6 things doth the Lord hate. 7 are an abomination unto him," but it starts right out, a proud look. Pride. And then it goes into a lying tongue, and then a number of things. And you used the word superiority complex. Isaac at the beginning made it very, very clear, and you just talked about it again. We all are a part of groups of which we feel comfortable. We tend to trust those that are a part of our group. But we also sinfully, when pride is in there, tend to think that my group is better than your group. And
Absolutely.
That group tends to think that they're better than my group, even though we may be a part of 10 different groups. You and I we're Christians, so we're part of a group. Well, there are some people who don't like Christians, right?
Absolutely.
So as we move into this and we look at the fact that, as you're saying, it's not institutionalized racism nearly as much as it is a prejudice and a pride because of a superiority complex built off pride that God hates, that we factor into this. Just curiosity, Joe, but if you look at our country today, this issue is consuming the media as we record this program. Do you think that the attitudes of division that we might call racism, white to black, or brown to brown, or brown to black, or whatever the variation may be, do you think that it actually is in reality worse now than it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago, or perhaps have the media and others exploited something that has not been solved perhaps yet, but made it more of an issue? What are your thoughts on that?
I think on an individual basis, I think that we are, as a society, becoming more culturally aware of other cultures. You know, if you look at, I see some young white kids who live in the suburbs that are imitating some of these rappers who come from the inner city. And so culturally, we're becoming more aware of each other. But the media does such a good job. And I'm using kind of a general term when I say mainstream media. They're doing a really good job at accentuating an issue, because statistically speaking, this deal with George Floyd, statistically speaking, the amount of Black males that have died at the hands of police are actually going down. But and the other statistic I like to throw out there is, although there has been some issues and it's disproportionate, 2 times more white people get killed by police than Black people. But why is it not that I want to, but why have I never seen a white person on CNN that got killed by a police officer? Because it's not as a big of a thing, right? A selling point or getting people's attention. It gets more attention when we show that there's this racial divide between these two people, as opposed to simply reporting the news. And so perception becomes reality when the only thing I've ever seen is this negative interaction between the races. But I would say on an individual basis, we have become more culturally aware of each other and even embracing other cultures in America more so than we have in the past.
And Joe, that's been my sense as well, but we all tend to know only that which is around us. And so we say, well, maybe that's my experience, but maybe that's not what's across the country. You've just offered another perspective that builds up. Let me go to this question now. You are a pastor. You've also led a movement, the 2019 movement, which is built on communication, dialogue, but with an effort towards reconciliation. In that regard, how important is it right now that we, as people who want to have a healing, not a further divide, how important is dialogue? And how do you, in your efforts, lead people towards the concept of healing and reconciliation? And share with us how we collectively, because we have a lot of people watching this program all over the country, and they're of all colors and all stripes and persuasions, but this principle applies to us all. How would you instruct us in this area, Joe?
Absolutely. So, Sam, one of the things I really appreciate about you is many years ago when I came to you and I was sharing with you about the 2019 movement, and I was talking about how important racial reconciliation is for the nation, but especially as the body of Christ, because we have been given the ministry of reconciliation. And one of the conversations I remember us having is, as I began to share with you some of the issues that people of color have faced and are facing in America, I knew that you weren't aware of those things. And I always said that you didn't know what you didn't know. And so without us taking this proactive stance, people in certain communities, like the African American community, can have the perception that white America doesn't care about some of the real issues that they face. But again, you don't know what you don't know. And so it's important to me, it has been important to me for many years, that I reach across lines, that we have these conversations, because in order for real reconciliation to occur, we have to have open and honest conversations, and we have to care about what each other understands or feels. And so I've always tried to come to people outside of our community to say, hey, let me share some of the struggles and challenges we've had historically and culturally in the African American community. And I do it as a way to seek after reconciliation, not to punish anyone or make anybody feel guilty or bad about our plight, but to educate and inform, because our job is to elevate and educate each other, right? And so when we have these conversations, it is important that we reach out to each other, that we start to understand each other in a way that helps to bring healing and reconciliation, because, as the scripture says, we are our brother's keeper, right? And what we deal with one community eventually will spill over into other communities, whether we want it or not.
And Brother Joe, I tell you, and I'm calling you Brother Joe, and that's fine because you are my Christian brother. And
absolutely.
And because of that, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk like that, hopefully you are comfortable in speaking to others in that sense. because ultimately reconciliation, we know, and as we talk biblical worldview, comes through Jesus Christ. And at the foot of the cross, we know that everyone is equal. There is no one who is superior. The only superior person is Jesus Christ himself. And if we think that, we're a long way down the road to experiencing reconciliation and understanding this area of division does not need to be, nor should it be. When we come back, we're going to talk with Joe a little bit further, a little bit more solutions as we wrap up today's program.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of WBPH Philadelphia, positively different television.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. And as we wrap this program up, it's been a very interesting, very helpful program looking at, is it a racial divide or is it really a matter of the heart, of sinful pride? And our guest, Dr. Joseph Green, he's a pastor, an author, a church planter, a ministry leader. He's involved with lots of different things. He's also one of our co-hosts on the radio program, Stand in the Gap Today. And we've had him on our program before. But Joe, as we kind of wrap this up, you and Sam brought up this super important topic, very biblical, of reconciliation in the last segment. And we're actually going to have a part 2 to this program, so stay tuned, everyone. Next week, we'll have another one coming out. And in that program, Joe, get ready. We're going to ask you, these tough questions. What do we do, when there's movements like Black Lives Matter? Do we use their phrases? Do we use their words and ideologies? Does that tie us in? Should we say things like all lives matter? And how do we get to past all of the fluff and the misinformation that's out there in much of the media and dive right into the truth? And so as we close today, Joe, would you be able to challenge us maybe as your pastor, talk to us, like a pastor, and to those of us who are white or of European descent, what actions can we be taking to move towards reconciliation? And on the same hand, those of our viewers who are people of color, maybe of African descent or whatever, what can they be doing to help with the reconciliation? Because as you've said, we have our differences that we're born with, but we're really not as different as we think sometimes. But how do we wrap this up? How do we bring these into reconciliation?
Well, I like to talk about it on a couple of different levels. So first, on the natural level, we have to understand that not only as a society and as a nation, but as humanity, that whatever happens to any part of humanity will eventually affect another part of humanity. I read a story one time where they got some debris that washed up on the shore in California. And when they saw the debris, it had Asian writing on it, like Chinese or something. And so what happened was someone threw some trash in the ocean in China, and over time, it eventually came to the shores of California. And so I like to say that whatever happens in any part of humanity will eventually, affect all of humanity. That's on the natural level. On a spiritual level, God created us from one blood, and his desire was for all of us to come together, every tribe and every tongue, coming together in the spirit of unity and the bond of peace. In the book of Revelation tells us what heaven looks like, and it says that every tribe and every tongue comes together, right, to worship the Lamb of God. And so we as Bible-believing Christians filled with the Spirit of God and empowered by the kingdom of God have an obligation to go forward and try to fulfill the Great Commission, which was to preach the gospel to all nations, right? That word nations comes from the word ethnos, which means ethnicity. So preaching the gospel means we have to go beyond our own ethnic lines in order to reconcile to each other so that we can fulfill the commission that we were given by Jesus Christ.
And Joe, thank you so much for that. What a challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, this is part 1. You're going to stay with us for next week, come back. We're going to continue this. But if you caught what Joe Green just said, The hope of redemption through Jesus Christ brings together all the ethnos, the groups of the world, in one. That is where unity comes. That is how we cross the racial divide. Any divide that is out there is crossable through Jesus Christ. Now, it's not out of hope. That's a hope. I hope that you know that, and I hope that you communicate that with confidence, regardless of your station in life. Thanks for watching us. Communicate to us this week. Go to our website, standinthegapmedia.com.